This is my presentation for my thesis towards the Master's in Second Language Acquisition. I have titled it Mistakes Not Made, Evidence for Universal Grammar Found in the Mistakes of Children's L1 Acquisition. There we go. So this research reviews empirical studies of child language across cultures to find substantial trends in the mistakes that children do or do not make in the language learning as supported by quantitative and qualitative research. So any commonalities identified, and that is to say errors that children consistently do or do not make, could give support to the idea of universal grammar, or UG. Universal grammar, as proposed by Chomsky, is the notion that there are biologically derived rules that languages must adhere to that are ingrained in every human's brain from birth, allowing them to learn a language in the most effective and efficient way possible. That is to say, children are predisposed to understand structures and elements of language because they fit into predetermined templates in their brains. Universal grammar as a theory has been hotly contested. Many researchers say that there's no evidence or proof of universal grammar, or that the evidence given is too flimsy or too narrow to be indicative of all languages, and therefore does not give enough support or proof that the identified commonalities exist across all languages. The goal of this research project was to compile evidence together to give sufficient support for universal grammar through evidence and empirical evidence of mistakes made and not made. To do that, the guiding questions of this research were what mistakes do L1 learners typically make and consistently not make in the early years of language acquisition, and how does that evidence support or detract from Chomsky's theory of universal grammar? So this research is relevant to the field of language acquisition and linguistics. Universal grammar was first proposed in the mid-1960s, and since then there has been a consistent flow of studies looking to prove or disprove it. I completed a meta-analysis of research with collated results indicating support for universal grammar. But to do this, both the advantages and pitfalls of universal grammar were assessed to decide if it's still relevant and deserves credibility as a theory, as the field of linguistics and language acquisition are moving away from nativist theories and starting to adopt more interactionist and usage-based theories in general. This research set out to prove that universal grammar is still a valid theory and deserves consideration when teaching language acquisition and drafting language acquisition policies. For this research project, reviewed research articles were analyzed to find sufficient and varied evidence of errors made and not made during the language acquisition process. Articles explaining and detailing Chomsky's theory of universal grammar were also included for background knowledge and support, as were articles arguing against universal grammar to give a more holistic view. Multiple empirical research studies, including across numerous languages, give sufficient evidence that a phenomenon is widespread enough to give credence to universal grammar, which was the goal of this research project. There were limitations of this project, the first being that because this is a meta-analysis, I was really reliant on research that has already been done. And unfortunately, when talking about mistakes and language acquisition studies, a lot of the research is in English. For the studies that were not performed in English or were performed in English and maybe an additional language or two, it was often closely related languages like English and Spanish or English and French. And that makes it difficult to talk about something being a wide-reaching phenomenon when the examples and proof you have are pretty localized. Along with that, a limitation of universal grammar in general is that only 10% of all human languages spoken currently on Earth have been documented and recorded for study. So it's hard to talk about things being universal when we've only studied 10% of all of the languages that there are in the world today, not even to mention all the languages that have ever been spoken. So those were limitations affecting my research project. So for my findings section, because it was a really, really large section and this is a pre-recorded presentation, I really tried to cut it down to focus on the most impactful studies. And that is what I'm going to try to focus on because I wanted to try to condense all of the research into something that gets the point across but isn't too long. So one of the first things I found really interesting was consistencies in child-directed speech. So it's been found that across languages, 30% of all speech aimed at children is in the form of interrogatives. What that means is that a third of all speech that people direct at children is in the form of commands and is not intended to inspire discussions or conversation. So tell me this, go do that, clean up your room. All of these interrogatives are not meant to give children varied exposure to language. Instead, they're just commanding children to do things. Another interesting part of this study was that they found that the mean length of speech directed at children is only 4 words long. It would be really, really difficult for children to learn and become fluent in a language when the average length of speech they hear directed at them is only 4 words, which leads a lot of linguists, or has led a lot of linguists, to the poverty of the stimulus argument. So many linguists argue that the fact that children can generalize correct rules for grammatical concepts for their language from a relatively small amount of stimuli and exposure indicates that they have innate processes allowing them to acquire their native language with limited exposure. That is to say that children are consistently able to use grammatical structures they've had minimal or no exposure to. And that gives support to the idea that there's something innate or biological helping to guide them. So moving on to a really interesting study, which unfortunately was performed in English, and I was unable to locate any comparable studies in other languages, but it still has really impactful results, and it is on auxiliaries. So auxiliaries in English make up a really elaborate system. There are 24 billion possible combinations of auxiliaries. And of those, only about 100 are grammatically correct. So he has been eating is grammatically correct. That is a correct sentence, but he did be eating is not. What's really interesting is that because there are so many possibilities, we would expect children to make errors. And yet, when researchers studied 66,000 sentences produced by 3-year-olds, they were unable to find any auxiliary errors in these child-produced sentences. We would expect to see some mistakes when there are so many possible variations. So the fact that there aren't any mistakes being made gives credence to there being something else helping guide children, and more studies definitely should be done. So moving on to word order, the grammatical order of sentences varies across languages, yet children are consistently able to use correct order even in early utterances. So some languages are subject, verb, object, some are subject, object, verb. There are languages that use categories that don't exist in English. There's so many different possibilities for correct word orders across languages, and yet children are consistently able to create correctly ordered sentences from a very young age. And in fact, children as young as 2, when tested in English, French, and German, could make correctly ordered sentences consistently, which shows that they have not only a deep understanding of the correct word order of their language, but also an understanding of the varied syntactic categories of their language. Another really interesting series of studies are on morphemes. So many languages use morphemes attached to root words to communicate additional information, such as tense, gender, object, quantity, or honorifics. An example in English is the suffix s, which we attach to the end of words to indicate quantities. It is worth noting that there are some languages that don't use morphemes at all. There's also polysynthetic languages, where entire English sentences worth of information are communicated with a single root word and extensive morphemes. Morphemes vary a lot in languages, and yet children, when studied in German, Italian, and Xhosa, They use correct morpheme agreement 83% of the time. That 17% of the time that they're making an error, 98% of those are from an omitted morpheme as opposed to an incorrectly applied morpheme. And what that tells us is that children are more willing to not add a morpheme at all than they are to incorrectly use one. So they don't always know which one is right, but they know what is wrong. Speaking of errors that are made, one of the most, and unfortunately, most of these studies were performed in English as well, but one of the most common forms of errors made by young children are overgeneralization errors. So, an overgeneralization error is when an incorrect allomorph is applied to a word where a regular form is substituted for an irregular form. So, saying hitted instead of hit, or runned instead of ran. Overgeneralization errors are really common. From the ages 18 months to about 5 years old, 10% of all child speech contains an overgeneralization error. It's interesting to see the errors that are made consistently to be able to then compare it to the mistakes children aren't making. Which actually leads into a really interesting study by Gordon in 1985 about plural compound words. So he found that children were consistently willing to make irregular compound words, such as mice eater, but they were unwilling to make regular plural compound words, such as rats eater. Gordon was unable to find sufficient evidence from the input that would have taught children that irregular compound words are acceptable, but regular compound words are not. Going off of this, Tomaseo believes the reason that children were unwilling to make a regular compound word was because the plural suffix s in English is always supposed to go at the end of words. So if it's in the middle of a compound word, it is incorrect. Pinker concurred with Tomaseo's original understanding, and he gives the example of how Darwinisms is correct if we're talking about the teachings of Darwin. That's grammatical. But if we're talking about the teachings of more than one Darwin, we cannot say Darwin's isms. That's not grammatically correct. And he believes that children were able to tap into this knowledge or this pattern from a very early age, and that it was impacting what compound words they were willing or unwilling to make, which is really interesting. There are a lot of critiques of universal grammar, which are worth noting, some of which were already addressed in limitations, but Ibbotson and Tomaseo present a pretty cohesive series of critiques in their 2016 article. So these critiques are not new. They have been consistently heard throughout the linguistic community since universal grammar was presented. But to summarize them, their first critique is that linguistic universals do not exist across all languages. And many universal principles may apply to one language family, but not other language groups. So if we're talking about something being universal, that's kind of a misnomer. Many principles were originally thought to be universal, but they were later found to not be present in all languages, such as subjacency, recursion, or binding principles, which then, again, that's a valid argument, and it is something that is addressed in parts of my paper. But moving on to their second argument, they say that the principles that have been put forward as potential universals are challenging to test and thus difficult to verify. If it is impossible to have empirical knowledge of how universal a principle is, it's impossible to verify that it is actually universal. So third argument, they call the linking problem grammar, which they describe as the inability to explain how innate universal grammar rules would be linked to the grammar of the individual languages around them. So how could universal grammar be connected from internal factors to external languages? there has not been a sufficient proposal for how that would work, and it is a solid detractor against nativist beliefs. The fourth argument, which is presented, is the usage-based argument, which is just that usage-based theories are more plausible and valid arguments, they find. And they posit that from a young age, children learn languages through social interactions and practice making correct sentences in social situations. So they argue that usage-based theory explains cognitive processes involved in language learning better and gives a more comprehensive view of how children learn, using processes like schematization, decontextualization, habituation, and automation. And they conclude their argument that universal grammar just has too many unanswerable questions that can't be explained. And in the place of universal grammar and nativist theories, we must turn to a new theory to explain and help researchers understand language acquisition. And I think that there's validity in reviewing other methods and continuing to always look to answer questions in new ways with new theories, but it doesn't detract from the evidence supporting universal grammar and the evidence and consistent results which have been found in studies testing the innateness or the consistency of different research elements, which Abatson and Tomateo just skim over in their critique. So if you want to critique universal grammar, you need to then propose both how the results, which were consistent and valid, were found and how they relate to the new theories, but also you need to answer the questions that you're saying universal grammar and nativist views are unable to answer. We can't poke holes in nativist views without trying to fill them with a new method or a new theory. So in conclusion, there is a lot of variance across languages, and there are areas where young children make mistakes, but there's also areas where they consistently are not making mistakes, even across languages, be it in word order, be it in morpheme usage. Children are able to apply their knowledge consistently. That doesn't mean that there aren't deterrents and that there aren't issues with universal grammar, such as how there are not extensive studies cross-linguistically and that not all languages have been studied. So for now, it's impossible to prove the actual universal nature of a lot of the purported principles of universal grammar, but the consistent results being found and that have been found in studies from a nativist point of view, they do give credence and support to the potential innate qualities that do deserve further studies, even as we're moving away from nativist beliefs. It's worth considering to validate all versions of language acquisition to fill different gaps in our knowledge, because it honestly, language acquisition, nobody really understands 100% how it works, and it's probably a mixture of a lot of different theories. So as we continue to grow in the field of language acquisition, it is worth continuing to look for new answers, but still consider the validity of previously proposed answers as well. So that is my research project, and thank you for your time today.